Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. On Monday, the nation celebrated the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During his lifetime, Dr. King's overriding message was one of equality and justice for all. It's clear that Americans are still working to resolve those very issues 54 years after Dr. King's assassination. Today, we're revisiting the second part of a recent conversation I had with Vermont's Executive Director of Racial Equity, Xusana Davis. Ms. Davis leads the state's effort to develop policies that improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. But she cannot do this on her own.
It means I get the job title for something that everyone's responsible for. Equity happens in a lot of sectors, and so it doesn't matter what your occupation is, equity is still your job. And so in my case, that means looking at everything from policy and other decision points from the perspective of that specifically incorporates people who have been deliberately oppressed for centuries in this country.
And before we get going with the rest of today's conversation, could you explain the difference between racism and systemic racism, since we'll get into that a bit?
Yeah. Systemic racism is a flavor of racism. It's just a type. There's individual racism, institutional, and systemic racism. Systemic racism is where it's really built into our lives. In other words, you could get rid of a racist person, but the policy will still remain. And so the practice that is racist will continue. For example, the New Deal excluded domestic and agricultural laborers. It appeared to be excluding careers or occupations, but in reality, at the time in the country's history, those were almost exclusively Black people. So it was framed as a race neutral way to exclude people, but in reality, it was very targeted toward race. Another one, believe it or not, is why we don't tip flight attendants. It's a longer story, but the short version of it is that at the time when commercial flying was first made available to the public, people were nervous, and so they had flight crews that were all white men to inspire confidence in people. And it was at that time in the nation's history considered rude or condescending to tip a white man. So categorically, we didn't tip anyone in that profession because they were all white men. Fast forward to today, the profession has diversified, but the practice remains in place, not because of the profession, but because of who it was at the time.
So interesting. So back to your job, what points of racial disparities have you found in Vermont state government? And what actions are being taken to deal with those?
Well, an important point here is that racial disparity is different from racism, right? Some racial disparities are definitely the result of racism. And sometimes, and this is something that kind of surprised me in Vermont, was there were some times that people just genuinely didn't know. And it's hard to believe, I think, when you come from a more diverse environment that somebody could not know, but I've learned that increasingly here. So for example, some things include recruitment. We know that recruitment for state positions is hard because we don't have a lot of people of color coming to the state. And that's not necessarily racist in and of itself, but why is it that people of color aren't coming to the state? Oftentimes because of racism, individual and systemic. We know that housing and housing discrimination are something that we're battling against. Internal processes haven't caught up to the changing demographic. Like, for example, we recently put a policy in place that covers religious head coverings during the booking process if a person's being arrested. So if you wear kufi or yarmulke, hijab, niqab, burqa, etc., we didn't have a standard policy for how to deal with that with like photography in the booking process. So it's things like that people often tell me we didn't intentionally omit it. It's just we never thought of it.
Right. I want to go back to recruitment for a second, because it's people say it's hard to recruit for a diverse workforce in Vermont, but it's so important. And then there's also retention, and how what do we do that can be challenging. So your thoughts about retention and recruitment, a little bit deeper there.
Yeah, so retention is really the big piece of it. It requires a lot more effort on our part, and it is the long game, right? So recruitment, we can bring anybody to the state with a good job, but if the person is living here and is surrounded by people who are displaying all kinds of hate symbols around their properties, around their cars, or if their children are being bullied in school or called racial slurs and administration does nothing about it, or if there aren't culturally relevant foods in grocery stores near them, et cetera, then that good job is one thing, but we're not going to be able to retain people because we have to look at people holistically as whole persons. And so retention means making sure that we're partnering with the housing sector to say, hey, you know what? We've got a lot of people like educators who have come to the state and there's nowhere for them to live because the housing market in Vermont is outrageously overpriced right now. So when we think about who wants to come here, who's a prospective new resident who just is being shut out for one reason or another, those are the kinds of tangible, meaningful investments that we talked about yesterday that need to be made.
Sure, and all of our towns can work on that, and school systems. So how have the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches, all of which you are looking at and investigated, how have they responded to you and your ideas and suggestions?
I think they've responded very well. I have noticed a deep sincerity from all three branches, and I really can say that confidently. The hardest part is timing, because everyone kind of wants to do their own thing, and everyone's coming onto this road from a different on-ramp. So we have some legislators who are extremely motivated by matters of equity. And so we end up with 6 bills on the same topic all at once. And it's really difficult to say to them, hey, actually, we've got an initiative in the works. Do you want to press pause on this? And it's just, coordination is really hard, but I have found very deep sincerity from all three branches. And I'm happy to say that because my counterparts in other jurisdictions often have to struggle with their own principles to legitimize the work. And that's something that I'm relieved that I don't have to do in this position.
Right. So policing is now certainly a front burner issue. How is your office engaging with state and local police forces?
I really would love to engage more with local police. I haven't had so much opportunity, again, bandwidth issues, but there's actually a pilot program that I have had kind of waiting in the wings that I hope will help to engage more municipal and county level law enforcement. As far as the state police goes, we do have a close working relationship, and they're particularly with their fair and impartial policing team. So I have found, again, a lot of warmth and a lot of success working with them.
So what will progress for you in equity and diversity look like in our state departments and agencies? I mean, even if you're dealing with like putting together 6 policies that different people have made and making them into one, but what will progress look like?
I think a lot of progress has been made even before I got here, and we're just kind of ramping it up. So some of the progress is going to be the behind the scenes things that are not sexy, that are not flashy, that members of the public may not really care about, but that do make a difference. Things like longer application windows for the public, so that maybe if you're limited English proficient, you don't just get 5 business days to apply for a program. You might get a little bit more time so that you can work on having things translated, et cetera. It means the state having more things translated and having more comfort with the translation process among line staff, so that if a person walks into your public facing office not speaking English, it's second nature to you to know what to do and not make that person feel othered. Mm-hmm. It means more inclusion in state government roles, especially in supervisory and managerial level positions. And it means having more roles where equity is an explicit job duty. And I suppose also just fewer complaints would be nice as well. Those are just going to be some of the markers of progress, I think.
Great. And among your many tasks is data collection. How well can progress be measured?
You know, it's tricky because the data in Vermont are sparse, and also different sectors have different requirements, right? So for example, think in the health sector, they have HIPAA and other health privacy laws, or we have criminal justice system where public records may or may not be accessible to people. So data collection is tricky. And of course, we rely on larger data sets that might be kind of questionable, like census data. I'm giving a lot of side eye to the 2020 census numbers because of some of the data aggregation and reporting metrics that the US Census Bureau has been using. So it is difficult, and making databases talk to each other is also challenging. But we have a lot of eyes on this, particularly in health and criminal justice. So I'm really hopeful that we can get it together and come up with meaningful, cohesive data sets that tell a story and that are accurate. And a lot of that really does happen at the individual level. For example, whether a person codes a traffic stop as being a traffic stop of a person of color because the driver was of color versus, well, the driver wasn't of color, but the 4 people in the other 4 other passengers in the car were of color, and that's why the car was stopped. That's not necessarily going to be reflected on the record of the stop. And so the ways in which we collect data at the individual level really shape the story that the data tell us.
Interesting. So you've been an office of one and in constant demand, among other things, sitting on 14 legislative committees. Were you able to get more resources to support your work? I know it's been in the works.
You know, it's more than 14 committees now.
I bet.
Every year it grows like a beautiful tree of bureaucracy. But yes, we did get staff. We were approved for 2 staff, and we are currently in the process of onboarding. Very pleased to say that we received almost 50, I think, applications overall between the 2 positions. So we're just looking forward to combing through them and finding the right people.
Great. So it's in the future. And what would you focus on when your office has more capacity?
So one of the positions is going to be focused on education and outreach. So that person is going to be a lot more public facing and is going to be interacting with the community, fielding and routing inquiries from the public, and is going to be helping to build our training curricula for state trainings. And then the other person is really going to be focused on data research and policy. And that's going to be a lot more internal work, right? Making sure that we're in compliance with all applicable regulations, making sure that when there are legislative proposals that we have time to analyze them with a lot more depth, and just provide guidance to all of the branches really who are seeking that technical assistance. It really is the same things that we've been working on, but we'll be very happy to be able to do much more of it and just be available to more people and more agencies more often.
Okay. Well, good luck to you and your office. Xusana Davis, the Executive Director of Racial Equity for the state of Vermont. Xusana, thank you so much for being with us for the past 2 days, and please come back and visit us again anytime.
I absolutely will. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this conversation.
Terrific. And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.